This is Can You Believe It? We believe that all truth is God's truth, and our responsibility is to find our truth wherever it may be found and to share it with the rest of humanity on God's green earth. I want to conclude our series on how did we get here by continuing from where we left with the influence of Charles Davenport and the propagation of the myth of race, and especially with the history behind eugenics. Charles Davenport received his Ph.D. at Harvard University and taught at Harvard University and the University of Chicago. Davenport became one of the leading proponents of American eugenics. Allow me to quote directly from Davenport. This is what he said. I quote, "The permanent improvement of the race can only be brought about by breeding the best. We have in this country the grave problem of the Negro, a race whose mental development is, on the average, far below the average of the Caucasian. I mean, we hope at last that the Negro mind shall be as teachable, as elastic, as original, and as fruitful as the Caucasians, or must future generations indefinitely start from the same low plan and yield the same meager results? The prevailing opinion says that we must face the latter alternative. If this were so, it would be best to export the black race at once." End of quote. You see, Davenport was a very adamant proponent, or rather advocate, of eugenics, or the science of eugenics, if you want to call it a science for that matter. Davenport lost his son as he grew up to polio in 1916, and Davenport also died in 1934 of pneumonia as a very frustrated man, even after receiving lots of money from Mary Harriman, who was the widow of E.H. Harriman of Union Pacific Railroad, to promote eugenics in America. Well, another gentleman by the name of Alexander Graham Bell was a sheep breeder and a horse breeder, and also the governor of California, accompanied by Leland Stanford or Stanford, and John Rockefeller, the oil tycoon, Henry Ford, the motor vehicle guy, and J.H. Kellogg, the cereal Mongol, and C.H. Gamble of Procter and Gamble, J.P. Morgan of U.S. Steel, and Mrs. H.B. DuPont of the chemical company were also very big fund drivers of this science of eugenics in the 1900s, including Theodore Roosevelt, because Theodore Roosevelt writes on January 3rd of 1913 in a letter to Mrs. Davenport. This is what Theodore Roosevelt writes in 1913. "My dear Mr. Davenport, I am greatly interested. You say that these people are not themselves responsible, that it is society that is responsible. I agree with you if you mean that society has no business to permit degenerates to reproduce their kind. It is really extraordinary that our people refuse to apply to human beings such elementary knowledge as such as every successful farmer is obligated to apply his own stock breeding. We fail to understand that such conduct is rational compared to the conduct of a nation that permits unlimited breeding from the worst stocks, physically and morally. Someday, we will realize that the prime duty, the inescapable duty of the good citizen of the right type is to leave his or her blood behind him in the world, and that we have no business to permit the perpetuation of citizens of the wrong type." End of quote. That is by Theodore Roosevelt writing to Mr. Davenport in response to his theory that we must only breed a particular type of individual. By 1912, Davenport textbook, which was titled Heredity in Relations to Eugenics, and a few others by Knott and Glayton and Gibbonneau, whom we've already looked at, had become widely used in the sciences of biology and psychology and social science departments in American and European universities to influence the spread of this theory of eugenics. By 1920, eugenics was big time, and the goal of the movement, or the goals of the movement were, number one, to promote selective breeding. Secondly, to sterilize and castrate those who are unfit. Third, the use of intelligence testing to identify those who are mentally deficient individuals and to identify differences in intelligence between racial and ethnic groups, which was dubbed by philosophers racial psychology. And fourth, to limit the migration or the immigration of various ethnic and racial groups within the Americas. So in July of 1912, the first International Eugenics Congress was held in London. About 400 delegates attended, and these delegates came from America, Belgium, England, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Norway, and Japan. And the most respected and financially powerful, get that, well-known and influential politicians, academicians, university administrators, and scientists of Europe and America attended this conference, which was held in 1912, again in London. A major Leonard Darwin, and who was Charles Darwin's son, who was the president of the Eugenics Society of London from 1891 to 1928, was appointed president of the meeting that was held in 1912. Winston Churchill, a very respected leader, represented the king. US Presidents William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson were also active supporters of the eugenics movement. Charles Davenport again writes in 1915, and I quote again, apart from migration, there is only one way to get socially desirable traits into our social life, and that is by reproduction. That is only one way to get them out, by preventing their reproduction by breeding. End of quote. So in the United States, during slavery and the civil marriage, bonds were mainly driven by race. Because in 1913, 29 states out of the 40 states that were already part of the United States had forbade racial mixing. 19 states prohibited marriage between African Americans and whites, and other 8 states added the Chinese and the Japanese to that mix. So if you lived in the state of Nevada, for that matter, in 1913 and were white, you were not allowed to mingle, to marry the Ethiopian or the immigrants from the African continent, the Malayans and the Mongolians, or the American Indians for that matter. And again, Davenport writes in 1912, I'm going to quote Davenport again because he's so influential in this sixth science of eugenics. This is what Davenport wrote in 1912. I quote, we trace back a continuous trait of the defects until the conclusion is forced upon us that the defects of this germ sperm have surely come all the way down from man's ape-like ancestors. Though a possible cure for problems caused by the poor, the criminal, the uneducated, the physically and mentally unhealthy and the inferior races of the world. End of quote. Well, 10 groups were targeted as being socially unfit. I want you to see where this is going in a minute here. Those who were deemed as feeble-minded, those who were paupers or the poor, the alcoholics, the criminals, including petty criminals, and those who were jailed for non-payment of fines, the epileptics, the insane, the constitutionally weak, and those who had specific or specified diseases, those who had deformities of all kinds, those who are blind and mute with no indication of the severity of these disabilities ever getting to be healed. Again, these were they made up this group that were intended to be eliminated and not allowed to propagate at all. So the remedies proposed to eliminate this inferior gems plum included restrictive marriage, laws that were not allowing them to intermarry, compulsory birth control, forced segregation, listen to this, sterilization and euthanasia. Although it was believed that it was too early to implement euthanasia, but people thought of it. What about we just take them out, even though it's not their time to die? You see, the science was based on eliminating those who are weak and poor and those who look different in society. So Goddard, whom we looked at before, and Davenport all believed that stopping the reproduction of the unfit would greatly reduce their numbers within a few generations. Well, what happened? Let's see. Because from 1912 well into the 1930s, the believers of eugenics worked hard to pass marriage legislation in Europe and in Americas. By the 1930s, there were laws prohibiting the marriage of alcoholics in 4 states and of epileptics in 17 states and of the feeble-minded in 41 states. So it's getting deeper and deeper into actually this theory being put into practice. In 1913, Davenport went on to stress that intermarriage between African Americans and Eastern Europeans whose genetic stock was inferior with Americans threatened the future of the country. So in 1919, distinguished geneticist by the name of Edward East and Donald Jones, like Davenport, believed that mixing an inferior stock with a superior one led to a lowering of the superior stock and thus reverting to the philosophy of David Hume and Immanuel Kant. If you're not familiar with Davenport or with David Hume or Immanuel Kant, listen to previous episodes from this series on How Did We Get Here. So Davenport and East and Jones stated, and again, I'm going to give a direct quote here, in reality, the Negro is inferior to the white. This is not hypothesis or supposition. It is a crude statement of actual fact. The Negro has given to the world no original habitat. He has never risen in competition with the white race. He has failed to approach its standard. End of quote. That is, Davenport is echoing again Immanuel Kant and David Hume and Comte as far as their views on the issues of race and most of the African American Negro. So in 1916, Alexander Graham Bell, who was another avid eugenicist, suggested that the United States Bureau of the Census begin assisting the Eugenics Record Office in its efforts to collect data on family lineages by adding fathers and mothers' names to individual records. It's getting deeper here. So the Census Bureau in 1880 had categorically refused to do this, but soon afterwards, Eugenics records office added surveys of all custodial and charitable facilities and jails to their list. And for instance, the state of Virginia agreed to work with the Eugenics Record Office by a gentleman by the name of Walter Plucker, who was a radical racist, led the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Virginia from 1914 through 1942. So Walter Plucker's main interest was to maintain Virginia's race purity and prevent racial mixed marriages. Richmond Times Dispatch, again based in again Virginia, wrote an editorial in 1924 while the legislation was being debated, and this is what the news outlet said. I quote: "America is heading towards Mongolianism. Thousands of men and women who pass for white persons in this state have their veins with Negro blood. It will sound the death knell or kneel of the white man. Once a drop of inferior blood gets in his veins, his descendants lower and lower in the mongrel scale." End of quote. That was from, again, the newspaper of the day by the name of Richmond Times Dispatch. Again, telling them that this was kind of too late because there was too much blood already involved with any of the Caucasian community. So, Virginia Racial Integrity Act was passed in March of 1924, and falsely registering one's race became a felony punishable by imprisonment of 1 to 5 years. Walter Plucker again worked to prohibit marriages between whites and non-whites, but also to prohibit non-whites from attending white schools. Well, we're going to come to 1952 here, and there'll be just more divisions within the whites and the American and the Caucasians in America. So the blacks were prevented from attending white schools, from traveling in white railroads, and from being buried in white cemeteries. Can you imagine? In 1925, well, the American Journal of Public Health considered the Virginia law the most perfect expression of the white ideal and the most important eugenical effort that has been made in the past 4,000 years. The states of Alabama and Georgia followed suit, and Wisconsin attempted to pass a similar law. And sterilization of the unfit, again, was being advocated for here. Even before the 1900s, you see sterilization being used as a means of controlling crime. So the first recommendation for sterilization was made at the Cincinnati Sanitarium in 1887 as a punishment and a way of controlling criminal activities. So in 1897, a sterilization law was introduced in the state of Michigan legislative house, but that law was defeated. When the state of Pennsylvania legislature enacted a similar law, it was voted but vetoed by the governor. A similar law was introduced in Kansas, but it failed to be approved. So the first law permitting the sterilization was enacted in Indiana in 1907, but in 1909, Washington and Connecticut and California passed the law. 1911 through 1912, New Jersey passed the law. The states of Illinois, state of Oregon, and Wisconsin completely rejected this law of sterilization. In 1920, many states officials were reluctant to enforce sterilization laws. So the Eugenics Record Office, superintended again by the name of Harry H. Lunglin, was very frustrated that sterilization was not taking off as fast as he had intended. By 1921, only 10 sterilization statutes were still in active use. Illinois, the state of Minnesota, New Hampshire, and Ohio revised their laws, but still failed to pass that law. 1914, Langley lamented the following. Here's a direct quote again from Langley. This is what Langley said. The present experimental sterilization laws have been pioneers, pointing the way and search they are to be commended as remedies for sexual deterioration. They have not thus far, in a national way, functioned. Indeed, less than 1,000 sterilizing operations have been performed under the immediate provisions or under the law that shadow of the 12 statutes. Unless all of the states cooperate in the purging of the blood of the American people of its bad strains, and their cooperation is supported by the federal government, as indicated in the calculations, should not be expected, should not expect the program to work as calculated. So by 1922, only 3,200 sterilizations had been performed on inmates of prisons, insane asylums, and feeble-minded other institutions of social welfare. And in 80% of these were in the state of California, of the 3,200. And in 1922, Langley had attempted to resuscitate interest in sterilization laws and policies by publishing Eugenics sterilization in the United States, which included copies of his model of sterilization laws. Another gentleman by the name of Albert Th.D, who was the first superintendent of the Virginia State Colony of Epileptics, feeble-minded in Lynchburg, Virginia, passed a law to sterilize colony residents before being discharged. Th.D began to sterilize women who had trouble with alcohol and who were considered to be insane, defective, weak-minded, wayward, backward, if you may want to say it that way, illegitimate, those who are homosexual and untruthful, criminal, immoral, promiscuous, oversexed, who are just people with a wanderlust from reproducing. So he wanted to sterilize all these kinds of people. So Th.D argued that his colony had a duty to society in the state of in Virginia to prevent such girls from being set free to breed defectives. This is what he called it. But Th.D became frustrated and temporarily suspended when he was sued for the harm he had inflicted on a mother and a daughter by the name of Willie and Jessie Mallory. He had sterilized these women without the state order, and when the state court appeals did not dismiss the lawsuit, Th.D wrote, and I quote again, "There's no use in the state trying to maintain an institution for defectives of the criminal class if the suit was unsuccessful, for that matter." So the lawsuit frightened all of the other superintendents in the states, and all the sterilization was stopped promptly. So without a law that could protect state doctors being dragged into court, it looked as if a robust plan for eugenical sterilization had no future in the state of Virginia, and served as a warning for doctors in the other states. Now, in 1841 through 1935, lived another gentleman by the name of Oliver Wardell Holmes Jr., who was an associate justice of the Supreme Court. Wardell was appointed Chief Justice by Th.D. Roosevelt in 1902. And Wardell Holmes Jr. allowed for the eugenical sterilization and thus opened the floodgates of sterilization in the Americas. So by 1930, 30 states had sterilization laws, and approximately 36,000 people had been sterilized. 30,000 of them were sterilized in 1927. Of these were people who didn't have good minds, people that were Black, people that were criminals, people that were defects of all different kinds. So in 1929, The first sterilization laws were passed in Denmark. Now we're getting out of the Americas. And in Germany, passed also its first compulsory sterilization laws in 1933. Now, this is going to lay a groundwork to the evil that's going to take place in Germany during the Hitler regime. Other sterilization laws were also passed in the Canadian province of British Columbia in 1933. Norway, again, these were passed in 1934. In Sweden, 1934. Finland, 1935. Estonia, 1936. And Iceland in 1938. So by the end of 1945, Germany as a country had sterilized approximately 2 million people without their consent. And the USA was using applied genetics as the basis of its sterilization policy and racial eugenics to support its immigration policies. First to deport and then to exterminate certain ethnic and racial groups. Germany was the first to use racial eugenics, as the idea was first proposed in 1911 to eliminate the defective germ plasm. And by the end of World War II, the Nazis had exterminated over 6 million people. See, Hitler's eugenics program of sterilization, of getting rid of defectives, was soon followed by the act of extermination of inferior people. First, defectives, then inferior. Well, we can agree from this that mankind has done things that have not been good. And all this has come due to selfishness and due to greed and having a false view of who human beings are. Well, we know from the book of Genesis that God said, let's make man or mankind in our image, in our likeness. And so that they may rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, over livestock and over wild animals and all of the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. So from the book of Genesis, we see that we have no class of inferiors, but men and women God created. We don't see any degenerates being created here. These are just myths that have been created by mankind to propagate lies. So we have to be careful that we are not fed lies by those who consider to be knowledgeable, those who have had an opportunity to go to school, may make up theories that will end up taking us out of the right path. That's why we need to be well informed and expose this truth to everybody so you can know who you are, created in the image of God. And God, after he created them, he said, he blessed them. He said, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So it is very clear that this eugenics theory, the fake science of eugenics, really did a lot of evil to humanity. God forgive us, because we are all created in the image of God. If you need a kidney, the doctor will not ask you, go get me a kidney from a black man or from a white man. He basically says, give me a match as far as the blood is concerned. The external does not matter. Paul, writing in Galatians, reminds the Galatian people that tended to want to go in this direction of grouping people into different categories. He tells them that there's no Jew, there's no Gentile, there's no slave, there's no free, there's no male, there's no female. We are all one in Christ. We are all created in the image of God. So be informed and know that we come from a history that's not been very fair to some people in society. But thank God for education. Thank God for where we are today. I think we are moving in the right direction. Talk to you soon.